Labor releases its costings and the opposition leader continues to argue welcome to country ceremonies are overdone on the first day of the final week of the election campaign. I'm Evelyn Manfield, live from the lands of the Ngunnawal people in Canberra. Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. Labor says the budget will be around $1 billion better off over 4 years compared to the March budget after releasing its pre-election costings. The government claims $6.4 billion of savings from a lower spend on consultants and an additional $760 million from increased student visa application charges. What will that lower spend actually look like for the public sector? I'll speak to the Finance Minister, Katy Gallagher, in just a moment. Opposition leader Peter Dutton doesn't think Anzac Day dawn services need to have a welcome to country, claiming the majority of veterans don't want one. The comments follow booing at 2 services on Friday. So will a coalition government follow through on promises to defund welcome to country ceremonies? We'll ask our panel, Nationals Senator Matt Canavan and Greens Senator Barbara Pocock. Climate 200 founder Simon Holmescourt believes 4 teal independents are at risk this election, and he set up a so-called fighting fund asking for more donations. It comes as opposition leader Peter Dutton embarks on a blitz through teal territory. Mr Dutton was in the seat of Mackellar yesterday and will speak to incumbent independent Sophie Scamps later this hour. Let's begin with the opposition today, as Peter Dutton was peppered with questions about his support for welcome to country ceremonies after saying during the leaders' debate last night that he believed they were overdone. Now on Friday, after an Anzac Day dawn service was booed, the opposition leader said welcome to country was an important part of official ceremonies. Today, however, he told travelling media that the majority of veterans he'd spoken to didn't want the practice on Anzac Day.
On welcome to country as well, you said that it's overused and should happen at very significant events. Would you consider Anzac Day dawn ceremonies as an event significant enough to warrant a welcome to country?
No, it would be my answer to that. It's ultimately a decision for the individual organisers of the events, and they can make a decision based on their membership and what their board wants to do. I mean, that's the decision for them, and I'd respect that. But listening to a lot of veterans in this space, and Anzac Day is about our veterans. There's about 103,000 Australians who have died in service of our country. I think if you're listening to their sentiment, and we're respectful of that sentiment on Anzac Day, I think their majority view would be my read of our vets would be that they don't want it on that day.
Now, on the Prime Minister's campaign trail, the government announced a $20 million commitment to establish a trauma recovery centre on New South Wales's Central Coast this morning. He raised the hit Netflix drama Adolescence as an important part of a broader discussion about toxic online material. Now, over in the UK, Prime Minister Keir Starmer says he'll fund secondary schools to screen the show. Mr Albanese says he'd also encourage schools to show students the series.
I don't know if you've seen Adolescence. I encourage anyone to have a look at it. It's scary. It's scary. These parents depicted not knowing what their young son, who they love, has engaged in. I would encourage schools to show it. Absolutely I would. So important.
Now, since then, Labor has released its pre-election costings this afternoon in a bid to force the coalition to follow suit. The government says the budget will be around $1 billion better off over 4 years compared to the March budget. That's an improvement that marginally reduces the size of deficits forecast over the coming decade. I spoke to Finance Minister Katy Gallagher a short time ago. Minister, welcome back to Afternoon Briefing. Just earlier, you flagged $6.4 billion in savings by directing agencies to further reduce spending on consultants, contractors and labour hire, as well as some non-wage expenses like travel, hospitality and property. Can you give us some more details here? What are you cutting?
Yeah, so we've released our costings today, and thanks for having me on the show. And what our costings show is that we've been able to offset the spending that we've announced in the campaign and actually leave the budget in better shape than at budget time. So that's a significant commitment, and it shows that responsible economic management that we've brought to our budget processes. Essentially, where we want to find further whole-of-government savings is really in those areas you outlined. The government is a big spender in procurement and contracts, usually in the order of about $100 billion a year. We think there's room to make further reductions in that area to make sure that we are using every taxpayer's dollar wisely, but also we've resourced the public service properly. So we've got more staff there doing the jobs they need to do, and at that time we can look for further efficiencies through these savings across the 4 years. So they are modest in the spending, overall spending of government services. They don't affect programs or people, and that's a real contrast, I think, with what the opposition is saying, which is, you know, in the order of $28 billion worth of cuts and 41,000 jobs that they want to sack from the public service. We've taken a different approach.
I'm just curious, Minister, though, $6.4 billion, it's not nothing. So what exactly would be cut here in terms of consultancy? Like, what would that look like for one of our public service agencies?
Yeah, so in the last term, we found $5.3 billion in savings in this area. So it's a continuation, in a sense, of the approach that we took since 2022 when our first budget was handed down. And that really is saying to people and the public service secretaries, well, now that we are resourcing, we're putting people into the jobs to deliver the services, we expect to see a reduction in the use of consultants and contractors across your department. We think that is a reasonable and sensible approach because we are resourcing the public service properly. Again, a bit of a contrast between what the opposition are proposing. We'd also look at areas like hospitality, travel, legal, property savings. We've already seen quite a significant reduction in our leasing costs in the order of about 18%. We think more can be done there. So this is really looking, and I think the Australian people expect us to do this. When you're a big employer like the Commonwealth, how can you make sure that every dollar stretches as far as it needs to go?
Sure, just to briefly follow up on that, things like travel and hospitality, does that mean, I guess, they would have more of these meetings online rather in person? Is that what you'd be hoping for?
Well, absolutely. We've seen the nature of work change. People do a lot of work online. So I think in the last Parliament, we reduced that part of the budget by about $500 million. We've already found those savings. We want to continue to keep the pressure on. And this is at a time when we're essentially rebuilding the public service from the days of robo-debt and PwC. We want public servants doing public servant jobs. We will work with the CPSU, as we have in the first term, and make sure we protect the public servants and the services they provide. But at the same time, like any business or any big organisation, you've got to make sure that every dollar is being spent wisely.
You also mentioned in your press release, Minister, that agencies will be encouraged to find savings from productivity gains in things like flexible work and new technology. So how would that work in terms of savings as well?
So I've been in charge of the Digital Transformation Agency, the DTA. We are seeing increased utilisation of technology across workplaces across Australia. The public service is no different there. And I think there are further opportunities in whole-of-government purchasing around IT that we need to implement. So that's part of it. We need to make sure that those are being driven from the centre in the most cost-effective way. Often long-term contracts, sometimes 5 years, as we're renewing those. We need to make sure that we're getting the best outcome there. But also when it comes to working from home, and I mentioned property costs before, because we have got a hybrid workplace or where people are allowed to work flexibly, and we know, this has been a big issue in the election campaign when there was a threat to remove working from home arrangements. We've already seen that that desk utilisation is up, property leasing space is down. These are the types of returns to the budget, and what that means is we can then use that money to invest in, Medicare and all those other services that people want. But, we thought it was important, Jim, the Treasurer and I thought it was important to get the costings out, earlier than usual, Monday of the final week, and I guess now the pressure is on and we'd be calling on Peter Dutton to release their costings and be upfront with what the cuts are going to be to pay for those nuclear reactors he wants to build.
Sure, I just want to focus on your costings for now, Minister. Another part of this is to do with student visa applications. You've said that you'll raise an extra $760 million from increasing the cost of visa applications for students to $2,000, and that'll take place from the 1st of July this year. Is that sort of designed to be a deterrent for foreign students?
Not at all. I think it puts an appropriate price on the value of coming and studying in Australia. We know that students love, international students love to come and study here. It's highly sought after, our educational institutions, but we also feel like when we're, issuing visas, that they should properly reflect the benefit that comes from coming to study in Australia. That's good for the budget. I think it's good for international education and, a sensible and modest change to, again, repair the budget and ensure that we are able to fully offset the commitments we've made in this campaign and actually have a budget in a better nick than what was than we announced at budget time. That's not an insignificant statement to the Australian people about our responsible economic management.
Okay, I'm keen to cover a bit more ground today. You would have seen one of the world's biggest credit ratings agencies, S&P Global, has put both Labor and the Liberals on notice that Australia could lose its AAA credit rating if your election promises result in larger structural budget deficits. How seriously are you taking this warning?
Well, obviously we listened to global ratings agencies, and it was a Labor government that secured that AAA credit rating post-GFC, and it's one that we have done a lot of work to protect in government, and we will continue to do so. And I think our commitment of issuing our costings today that show that the budget is actually slightly better off over the forward estimates because of the decisions we've taken, reinforces the approach that we want to take, and I think is in line with some of those issues raised by S&P. But, again, in stark contrast to a $600 billion nuclear off-budget fund, I mean, that would completely destroy Australia's credit rating. So we've been sensible, careful.
Minister, if you're re-elected, can you guarantee that you would keep the credit rating?
Well, I think we've been clearly shown today the decisions we've taken about how much we respect the AAA credit rating. It is important, and the decisions we've made to offset all of our spendings to actually reduce the size of the deficit, deliver two surpluses, halve the deficit in this year, lower debt, lower the interest on that debt, actually shows the seriousness with which we approach this task, and again, I think stands in stark contrast to the opposition and their nuclear fantasy.
I want to ask you about another story today. It's been reported that Labor first became aware back in March that Russia had made some sort of request to transit aircraft through an Indonesia airbase. Was Cabinet briefed about this at the time?
Well, I think the PM has dealt with this today. I mean, we do not discuss intelligence briefings publicly. I mean, that is what a mature government in receipt of that information holds dear, that information is kept appropriately, not used in media responses. So I think the PM has answered that comprehensively today.
I also just want to ask you about some comments from opposition leader Peter Dutton. He was saying that an Anzac Day dawn service wouldn't necessarily be an event that he thinks should continue to have welcome to country ceremonies. What's your response to this? Do you think Anzac Day dawn services should have welcome to countries?
Well, I think Peter Dutton always goes to, trying to reignite culture wars when he's trying to avoid discussing things like costs and cuts of nuclear. And that's exactly what we're seeing. I think the PM again dealt with this last night. We think a welcome to country, acknowledgement of country shows respect. and that is important. But we also recognise that people have different views about this, and organisations make their own decisions about how they conduct their events. Now, I've been to many events where organisations have prioritised that respect for First Nations Australians and have either done an acknowledgement of country or asked for a welcome to country to be provided by a traditional owner, and I think that's appropriate. But I really think Peter Dutton is trying to distract from the big questions which he needs to answer, which are about costs and cuts.
Okay, Finance Minister Katy Gallagher, we really appreciate your time on this final week of the campaign. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Let's get some analysis on that interview and Labor's costings more broadly. We're joined now by our Chief Digital Political Correspondent, Jacob Grieber. Thanks for your time, Jacob.
G'day, g'day.
Were there surprises in these costings, do you think?
Look, the overall envelope of budget deficits into the future, something like $150 billion worth of accumulated deficits over the next 4 years. That hasn't changed much. We're talking about an overall saving here of $1 billion over 4 years. Mm-hmm. Now, a big chunk of it is coming from these consultants that Katy Gallagher has just been talking about. Labor's made about $10 billion worth of promises in the election campaign. They're getting $6.4 billion, so most of it, from cutting back on consultants. Now, that sounds big, prima facie, but actually, if you think about it, and as she said in your interview, Commonwealth spends about $100 billion a year on consultants, 1.6 billion roughly a year being reduced. It's kind of a rounding error. It's like one of those budgeting tricks that governments have up their sleeve. 6.4 sounds like a lot in the context of $400 billion. It's a little hollow log. So they're using that to say that they're paying for their election commitments. So in that sense, it's a bit of a political manoeuvre.
Right, so it's not sort of a huge portion of the broader cost. She did say, she was talking about foreign students and the price of visa applications there. She did say, though, that that wasn't designed to deter foreign students. What did you make of that number?
It's in the overall budget, it's not a big deal. It does mean, though, for applying for an application, or to get a student visa now, foreign students will have to pay up front $2,000. Now, that's going to be a significant cost for some of those applicants. Does sort of add to the message that we're giving offshore students, which is, A, the country's full, there's not enough accommodation, we're reducing the number of spots that are available. The overall message there, I think, is go to some other country for your tertiary education. So that's probably to the benefit of places like England and North America.
Right, yeah, certainly you can imagine students would notice that. I want to ask you just on the timing of the releasing of these costings. You've obviously covered many elections. Is this kind of early, or how does this fit in the scheme of things?
It's the same old budget costings pantomime that we get with every election. Labor last time around, 3 years ago, didn't release their costings until the Thursday before election day. We saw the coalition at that time in government making pretty much the same claim that Treasurer Jim Chalmers made today, which is the coalition must now release all of its costings. So we're going to go through that for the next 2 days. The coalition will then release its costings, very likely. They do that because if they weren't to release their costings, the Budget Office is legally required to do the costings after the election. So you can't hide after the fact. It will be exposed. So the opposition will release those costings, I would imagine, probably towards the end of the week.
Do you think the dial has sort of shifted, though, in what the public expects because we've had so many people pre-polling? I think it's over 2 million people already.
Well, that's the problem with releasing these things so late. Voters are going to the pre-polls without knowing about those budget numbers. Maybe some of those voters don't care, but it's really interesting. Earlier today, the ratings agency, one of Standard & Poor's, one of the big global ratings agency, issuing a warning saying that Australia's AAA credit rating, which is the best rating you can get, highly coveted. It's something Labor and the coalition have always said points to sound economic management and financial management. S&P warning that the level of spending, the increases in spending that all sides of politics are frankly baking into the pie, takes spending back to post-war highs, so way, way, way back to World War II. And they're warning that this could lead to much bigger budget deficits and more debt than is currently on the books. And that means the rating might be under threat. So that's a warning pretty much to the whole political class from S&P. And lands unusually in the last week of an election campaign.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. That was my next question, because it does feel like a big story, even with everything else going on. Jacob Griever, thank you for your analysis as always.
Thank you.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton was quizzed over the Coalition's candidate for the Western Sydney seat of Fowler, who the ABC revealed made a series of offensive comments on social media. He turned the question on the Greens and escalated his attacks, labelling the party Jew-hating and noting that Labor has preferenced them in some seats.
I'm not going to take a lecture from the Prime Minister, who has a relationship with the Greens, is accepting preferences from the Greens. In his own seat is preferencing a Green number 2. This is an anti-Semitic Jew-hating party, and they have been involved in all sorts of horrible, horrible doxing and comments online that are repugnant but not repudiated by the Prime Minister.
Now, to discuss this and some of the other news around today, let's bring in our political panel. We're joined by LNP Senator Matt Canavan and Greens Senator Barbara Pocock. Welcome to you both.
Hi, Evelyn. Good to be with you. Hello, Matt.
Matt Canavan, I wanted to start with you. We've heard these comments from opposition leader Peter Dutton today around the welcome to country, saying that they should be reserved for significant events. And he was asked specifically about Anzac Day dawn services and was suggesting that didn't meet the criteria. Do you agree that dawn services shouldn't have a welcome to country?
Yeah, I don't think it's appropriate, but then again, I'm happy to defer to the veterans who are actually honouring at these events. Now, I've been out and about this last week on pre-poll booths, met hundreds of people, and almost everybody that's raised this issue has said that they're sick and tired of the welcomes to country, the acknowledgements of country when the plane lands. They've just had enough of it. They've just had a gutful. And I think that's doing real damage to the otherwise harmonious relations we've got in this country, because we've cheapened this exercise. I think it started out with a good intent and goodwill as a welcome to country, but like anything, when you overuse it, it loses its significance and it's starting to irritate people. Now, in terms of Anzac Day, look, I think that day is a very solemn day. It's there to recognise especially those Australians who have fallen and made the ultimate sacrifice during our wars. Given that the welcome to country now is divisive, it's a fact now, it's an absolute fact that it's a divisive statement right now in our country. Now is not the time to be adding that to this statement, to this day and to this ceremony. It should remain solely and wholly about our veterans, about those people who have sacrificed for Australia.
I just want to pick up on that, Senator Canavan. Have you actually spoken to veterans, in particular First Nations veterans, or has anyone in your party had those discussions calling for welcome to country ceremonies to be removed?
I just spoke to a veteran today, an Indigenous veteran today. He said when he served, when he was overseas serving for our country, we're all Australians, we're all one people. And I've had not just veterans, but lots of Indigenous people I've spoken to over the past year are very, very concerned, since The Voice really, very, very concerned about how some elements, and often not Indigenous elements, they're often white fellas who are using Indigenous people for their own political purposes, are dividing our country in ways that are totally unnecessary. We saw that with The Voice, and that was roundly rejected by the Australian people because they don't want a country divided by race. That was very clear. And as I say, there could have been, and hopefully we will get back to a point where we can have ceremonies like this that are inclusive, that do rightly recognise the wonderful heritage of our Indigenous peoples in this country, but we have to do so in a way that's not lecturing, that's not hectoring people, and that's what people feel right now. They've just had enough of it, and I would say, as someone who wants to see very good relationships between all Australians, it would be best right now if we scale back the welcome to country ceremonies, because all they're doing is dividing our country.
Senator Barbara Pocock, I want to bring you into this discussion now. Do you think these comments from Peter Dutton today risk encouraging the type of behaviour that we saw at that Melbourne dawn service ceremony on Anzac Day, where we saw people booing, that was widely condemned? Does this risk, I guess, you know, having those people do that again?
Well, it was very widely condemned at that ceremony, and the ceremony I was at, and many of us were here in Adelaide and across our country, had welcomes to country which are a marker of respect. They're very important parts of ceremony and our culture now for many of us in very different settings across our lives and our community events. Very important markers of the fact that we live in a country with the oldest living culture on the planet, one that we're very, very proud of. And you could see in the response to people, the great majority of people in Melbourne, to that neo-Nazi intervention. And it's really disappointing. It's part of Peter Dutton's racist rhetoric that he's, you know, weighing in on this issue and creating division about it, entirely inappropriate, trying to win votes, trying to turn to a cultural divide, very Trumpian, and really not the way we need to do it in Australia. We want to respect and celebrate First Nations culture, and recognising connection to country for many of us is a very, very important part of our ceremonies on Anzac Day and many other times during the year.
Right, there's a lot to get to today, but Barbara Pocock, it sounds like you think that welcome to country ceremonies should stay. I just want to go back to you, Senator Canavan. Other than Anzac Day, is there an example of an event that doesn't meet the sort of threshold for you of needing a welcome to country?
Yeah, I've got a whole list.
Right.
I've got a whole list every time the plane lands. Let's get rid of that. That's ridiculous.
I believe that's
I've been
an
in meetings with
acknowledgement
people before
of
a
country.
meeting. Well, both of them. People have just had enough of them. Every meeting we have, yep, sure, get rid of that. Basically every event you go to as a politician has these things at the start where they acknowledge the stolen land or some such. Like, you feel such a hypocrite. It's like, well, why don't you give it back? Give it back to them if it's stolen. It's just cheapening the whole exercise here. So someone said to me once, I think this is perhaps a general and good rule of thumb, maybe. There might be some exceptions, as always with rules. But if an event is good enough for the national anthem to be played, yes, maybe we should consider having a welcome to country. If we're not going to play the national anthem at that event, don't have it. So don't have it at the workplace, don't have it at schools, don't have it at morning teas. Certainly don't have it when the plane lands every time. Just get the plane there safely. That's all I want you to do. I don't want a political lecture. People have had enough of politics in this country being force-fed down their throat by activists who, as I say, are trying to weaponise these otherwise were good-intentioned ceremonies. They're trying to activate those for their own political purposes, and people have had enough. That's clear. I mean, Barbara's saying this is some racist plot. I mean, the polls show that about 90% of Australians agree with Peter Dutton, that there's too many of these things. They should be scaled back. So
I'm not sure
I don't know what Barbara's saying there, but apparently 90% of Australians, well, 60,000 people voted online recently saying 90% of people say that it's too much. 90%. And that's certainly the feedback I'm getting on polling booths right through Queensland that I've been in the last week. People have had enough.
Right, I can imagine that public opinion on this is quite split, but we will move on. Senator Pocock, I wanted to get your response to some other comments from Liberal leader Peter Dutton today. He labelled the Greens anti-Semitic and Jew-hating. What's your response to that?
Well, I think these are deeply shocking and incredibly offensive comments. They are totally inappropriate and they are a lie. My party, the Greens, have stood strong forever against racism, against anti-Semitism and against Islamophobia. And it is incredibly offensive that the person who purports to want to be the leader of our country would use this kind of language in such a dishonest way and as a very clear and totally Trumpian effort to draw attention away from the failings, the really monumental failings of his own election campaign. We have seen error after error. We are seeing massive challenges around the selection of candidates who are inappropriate to be standing to represent Australian people. And this is an attempt by Peter Dutton to create an incredibly inappropriate and dishonest distraction from the failings of his campaign. The Greens have stood very strong against anti-Semitism, and I find it personally very offensive, and I know everyone in our party room and the many people, millions of people who are going to vote Green in the coming election, who will find that offensive also. His language is really very wrong for this kind of moment, and we're in an election. He should be telling the truth, and he should be dealing with the issues that actually really matter to people right now, around cost of living and appropriate set of policies. Instead, he's using a racist card, racist language, which is highly offensive, and many Australians will share my horror at him using it as an attempt at distraction like this. It is so wrong, and someone who wants to be the leader of our country should not be speaking like this and telling such untruths.
Okay, we will move on. There's a lot of news to cover today. I wanted to ask you both about the two major parties have stood up in the last sort of week or so and talked about domestic violence. Men's violence against women has been labelled a national crisis in the term of Parliament that's just wrapped up, and there's been a specific mention of social media as a problem here. Now, where it stands, YouTube has been given a carve-out. Matt Canavan, do you think in 12 months' time, when this policy is reviewed, do you think YouTube should still be exempt?
Well, I don't support the scheme as a whole, actually. I'm at odds with my partner. I think I'm with Barbara on this one. Is that right? I can't quite remember. Late last year, we'll have some unity perhaps here. But no, I voted against the so-called social media ban because I don't think it's workable. And I think this particular issue you've highlighted demonstrates that you're trying to carve some companies out like YouTube. And look, I think YouTube actually is a quite wonderful educational tool used in the right way. There's a lot of rubbish on YouTube, but no offence to you, of course, not on your channel, but there's a lot of rubbish on TV too, but we still allow people to watch it. There's also huge amounts of educational content on YouTube, and I know from my own children the interests they've got that have been nourished by that content. So look, I understand why YouTube's being exempted, but then why not Rumble, why not Vimeo? There's some similar services. I think the government has wrapped itself up in way too much complexity because we rushed this bill through. My primary reason why I voted against it was we rushed it through within a week. That was totally unnecessary, not even set up yet, and now we've got problems like this.
Okay, I do remember that day on the floor of Parliament here. Barbara Pocock, if we don't go ahead with a social media ban just for argument's sake after 12 months' time, I mean, how do you crack down on some of this toxic content that young people are viewing online, perhaps without their parents even knowing about it?
I think the attempt at a social media ban is not going to work, and I think there are many experts who have studied this at length, and the evidence is there that that kind of ban will not work, and those kind of carve-outs are examples of the way in which it will fall over. We need to take responsibility for content to those very large organisations, companies that are making a lot of income out of it, and put that responsibility where it belongs with those organisations. And we need to really face up, as you said in your introduction, to the significant national challenge of the violence that is encountered by women and children across our country. We need to finance and properly fund those first-line services, those face-to-face services that we know are underfunded at present, leave so many of our women and children at risk for their lives, for their health, certainly subject to financial intimidation. And there are many things that we can be doing as a country. This issue has not had the attention, and many women are feeling it in this election. It needs to get the support, the funding and the responsibility in our social media with those big organisations so that they are forced to take responsibility. They have the means to deal with the issue of what's unfolding through social media, which has such a negative impact on keeping women and children safe.
Okay, Barbara Pocock, thank you. Senator Matt Canavan, thank you to you as well. There's much more that we could chat about, but that's all we have time for today. Thanks for joining Afternoon Briefing. Now, as we mentioned in our headlines a little earlier, Climate 200 founder Simon Holmescourt believes 4 Teal independents are at risk this election, and opposition leader Peter Dutton is targeting seats held or contested by independents this week. He's doing a blitz right around the country, and he started his attack with a visit to the seat of Mackellar yesterday. Now, Sophie Scamps is the independent MP for Mackellar and joins me now. Hi, Sophie.
Hi, good afternoon.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton, as I was just saying, is on this so-called blitz, hitting Teal seats around the country, visiting your seat yesterday. Now, in all of this as well, Simon Holmescourt has identified your seat as one of the ones potentially at risk. You only hold it on a 3.3% margin. Are you kind of on the verge of losing your seat? Is that a concern for you come Saturday?
Look, it feels really good on the ground. We've been talking to people, working really hard for 3 years, and I think that people are really happy that they finally had somebody who's showing up and working really hard for our community. We would take it for granted and ignored for decades, you know, of getting funding for very important local infrastructure. Our hospital was privatised by the coalition, the state coalition, been working really hard to get that back into public hands. People can see I've been working really hard and have some really great conversations on the ground. So it's feeling good for me on the ground, I've got to say.
I wanted to ask you about another independent, Monique Ryan. She, we heard this morning, has asked for supporters to contribute more to donations for a campaign to try and increase advertising. Have you done that as well to kind of spread the message further in this final week?
Look, we've really had to combat a lot of misleading false advertising, which has been thrown at us by the Liberal Party. We've had fake, what they call astroturfing groups, which are not real grassroots groups, which have been funded by the coal lobby, firing out, just saturating social media and other platforms with really misleading ads. And so that's the type of big Goliath that we're up against. And most of my fundraising has come directly from our community, direct to me. And so we're getting everything from the $5 donation up to bigger donations. And I've got to say, C200 does help. That is a crowdfunding organisation where people from around the country who want to see greater accountability, greater transparency and more solutions in our parliament. So they're donating as well, and up to 20,000 people have donated to Climate 200 now. So we're in the race of our lives. There's a whole, as you know, it's still totally legal to lie in political advertising. Zali Steggall has had a bill for truth in political advertising for 6 years now, and that has been resisted by the major parties. And in this election, I can 100% see why, because they rely on it. So that's what we're up against, and that's why we still need to be fundraising right to the very end.
You sort of alluded there to the crossbench. Of course, you know, there is perhaps an expectation that there could be a minority parliament. The Prime Minister has told the Financial Review that minority governments are inefficient. So I wanted to put that to you. How will you ensure that you're working efficiently should you be re-elected?
Look, I'll continue working the way that I've worked for the last 3 years, and that's working constructively towards solutions. What Australians are sick to death of is that two-party duopoly where they just go head-to-head and fight, and you see slanging matches. If you watch Question Time, you see it on display. What I do is work constructively across the political spectrum. I'm all about ideas, not ideology. We've got multiple crises: housing, environment, growing intergenerational inequality. Australians want solutions. They're sick to death of slanging matches, and I will work cooperatively and constructively with either side, and I will continue to do that.
You would obviously recall last election there was a huge focus on climate change. It hasn't quite been that way this election, perhaps you'd agree, just with the cost of living and housing really being the key factors. Does it make you concerned that there hasn't been that focus on climate change? Could it impact your success?
Look, I agree. Cost of living and housing have absolutely been at the forefront of people's mind, but that doesn't mean that they no longer want to see strong action on protecting our beautiful environment, our nature, and also action on climate. And we know that those younger generations really want to see action on those fronts. They don't want us to leave the mess for them to pick up. That's one of the main reasons I'm here. And that's why I'm also reaching out and making sure that young people also understand that this democracy is for them, that they are a part of it, and it needs to work for them, and their future is being created right here and now. So this democracy needs to work for everyone, and I think people still want that same level of action to prevent the very disastrous extreme weather events. Nobody wants that, the frequency of those, and we've already been seeing it. So it is still there in people's minds that we want to act on climate and protecting our environment.
If you are returned to Parliament, what specifically will you fight for to address climate change? What will you be pushing for when you're sitting on that crossbench?
I really want to see practical solutions that can be implemented right now. So we know that by 2035, 90% of our coal-fired power stations will be coming offline. That investment was not made decades ago. So we have a gap. We have 10 years to really make sure that we have a reliable energy source. So one of the ideas that I've been pushing this election since the beginning of the year is to call for those subsidies for batteries. So Australia leads the world when it comes to rooftop solar, but we have this deficit of batteries to back that up. So bringing in subsidies for batteries so you can store that really cheap electricity generated in the middle of the day and discharge it back to the grid in the evening peak. So you're not only reducing energy prices for those households and businesses, but you're reducing energy prices for absolutely everyone, is a way that we can act now to reduce our emissions, but also bring on reliable energy supply through that type of storage. I think that's a really practical, common sense way to go forward. And it cuts down on that need for those regional transmission lines as well that are very unpopular.
More broadly, I suppose, if we look at climate emissions, do you have a specific number that you'd like to see emissions reduced by come 2035?
So that's something that both the major parties were due to report on or make an announcement on in February. That's when it was due. Neither has done that. So they have not been upfront with the Australian people. They're both saying that they may or may not come up with something after the election. So what many of us on the crossbench have been calling for is a 75 by 35, something that's doable, but something that really makes a difference for our country and the amount of emissions that we have. We know we've got 2050 is a target, but we need the decade that is really crucial that we act on is right now in this decade over the next 10 years. So that's why we need to be acting now and not waiting till the late 2040s to make a difference. That's far too late.
Now, Sophie Scamps, I want to ask you about something totally different. The Prime Minister today has questioned the practice of cafe owners and restaurateurs where over public holidays, we've obviously just seen a number of them, that they hit customers with surcharges. What do you think of these surcharges? You know, when you get to the cafe and it's 10, 15% more, do you think that's fair?
Look, I've had a really strong focus this last term on small business. What we're seeing across my electorate and I think across Australia is empty shop fronts on those shopping strips across our electorate. And that is what nobody wants. We know that small businesses are the absolute backbone of our local economies, they're local jobs, but they're also our local community members. And we're seeing way too many hitting the wall and closing down. So we know that the cost of business has absolutely soared over the last 3 or 4 years. We're talking about wages, insurance, inflation.
I'm just going to quickly interrupt you, Sophie Scamps. So does that mean that you would like to see those surcharges stay?
Look, I think we need to listen to business. They are struggling, and so when they say that they either have to charge those surcharges or not open on those days, I think we need to listen to them. And I think that small business particularly needs a lot more support, which is why I've been calling for a tax-free threshold for small business and to make those instant asset write-offs permanent and to raise it. They need a lot more support than what they're currently getting from either side.
Independent Sophie Scamps, thank you very much for joining Afternoon Briefing.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, back at the 2022 election, Teal independents rode a wave of climate frustration right into Parliament. And Anthony Albanese promised to end what he dubbed the climate wars. Now, during the last term, the Prime Minister passed a number of reforms, some which Peter Dutton and the Coalition have promised to scrap if they're elected this weekend. But do voters still care about long-term issues when cost of living challenges are so immediate? Now, to discuss this, I spoke with Paul Smith from market research firm YouGov. Paul, thanks for joining us today on Afternoon Briefing. You've released a poll of just over 1,600 voters. The work was commissioned by the Climate Action Network. What does it show about how voters think about climate change this election?
Well, 62% of voters think that it's an important issue in considering their vote. And what that tells us is that when people make a decision, parties and candidates having an important and serious approach to this issue is important in people actually casting their vote. And that's particularly important amongst younger people, people who are millennials and people who are younger than that, people who are
Gen Z and stuff.
Yes, I'm sorry, I forgot Gen Z. Gen Z it's really important that people who are Gen Zs and millennials in particular see this as important, with 79 and 73% of people in those age groups thinking that's a really important consideration in their vote. So it's not just the majority of Australians who think that climate change is important, but it's also those voters who now form the new majority, millennials and Gen Zs, and the voters of the future.
How does it compare to previous elections? You know, I know last time it was sort of called the climate election. Has there been a change in attitudes this time round, given, you know, cost of living pressures and housing pressures facing so many Australians?
I think climate change has become a mainstream expectation of anyone who wants to form government. Having policies that address that issue that are serious, it's just it's the threshold of which you have to form government in this country and receive votes. And that doesn't mean people aren't prioritising and saying, well, look, I've got to get things down at the supermarket this afternoon, I'm concerned about the cost. But people think about their whole things in are you ready to form government? Because having a serious way of approaching the issues thrown up by climate change is a mainstream responsibility of government. And if you're not going to address climate change seriously, you're not a serious choice, particularly for younger voters who form the majority of this election. And I think that's something all parties and candidates should take seriously.
You also asked a question as part of this poll around nuclear power. How did respondents feel about nuclear power stations being established here in Australia?
Well, people are not particularly enthusiastic about that, and people also have a view that this is a costly exercise and again, not a mainstream solution. And I think that's what people in the election are very much focused on, is they're looking for people to offer serious solutions. And I think what comes up in this polling and all the published polling is that nuclear is seen as a costly and expensive exercise, one that will take quite a lot of time to actually to do, and it's not a serious proposition for the immediate transition to renewables and things that will actually deliver the energy that we need right now. And that's an important consideration for a lot of younger voters. You need to sound serious about your solutions, and they need to be costed and they need to be well set out. It's just as important to have a costed financial plan as it is to have a costed environmental plan, and that's what voters are looking for, something that's serious and it looks to address the issues.
So there's obviously lots of issues you've mentioned there that voters are concerned about. Can you pick sort of the number one? Is it still cost of living or housing?
Look, cost of living and housing are important for everybody, particularly young people, because young people have less money and they're trying to enter the housing market and it costs a lot. But what I'm saying is, in that context, climate change is one of those things where young people in particular, as shown by our survey, just see that's a threshold question, that it's like, can you balance the books. It's can you actually deal with climate change? And if you don't have that, you simply are not going to get consideration from the millennials and Gen Zs who now form the majority of voters in the electorate. And that's something for all parties need to consider.
You mentioned balancing the books there. Of course, the Labor government is forecasting a decade of deficits and we've got big spending on both sides. Is that something that voters still care about as much this election as, I suppose, compared to previous ones?
I think what voters actually tell us time and time again in our surveys is they're looking for big solutions to the problems facing this country. And that doesn't mean you're reckless about spending, but they're quite prepared to take a different approach. People see through COVID that there's a role for government to step in and step up. And I think the outlook of Australians now is very much that they are looking for government to provide big solutions to the problems facing the country, whether it's in health, in environment, in housing. They want the government to do more, not less.
So it's more a matter of they're looking for solutions rather than being too worried about the cost of these promises.
I think that people say, let's decide what we need to do that's important first, and then we'll work out a way to pay for it, just like they do in normal life.
Paul, I wanted to ask you about a poll from mid-February. The ABC published a YouGov poll that showed the coalition would be in the best position to form government if an election was held back then in February. It was estimated there was a 78% chance of a hung parliament and a 19% chance of the coalition winning in majority. We've obviously had a number of other polls published since then. What do you think has changed?
I think this has been the most extraordinary change in an election since 1993, when the opposition under John Hewson, having led for such an extraordinary amount of time, were rejected in the last weeks of the campaign because of the voter opposition to the Fight Back package. And what's happened here is something which is a little bit similar in that we've had the controversy about the coalition's work from home package, which is very unpopular. We've had that linking to Trump, which is also unpopular. And then people having a good look at the coalition and saying, you don't look quite like you're ready for government and you look like you're a risk. And that's why our last poll that came out on Friday showed Labor with a commanding lead, and that's largely driven by the unpopularity of Peter Dutton, who started the campaign with -2 as a rating, which is not too bad for a politician, and is now at -18 in terms of their net satisfaction. And he's now behind Anthony Albanese as preferred Prime Minister, 50 to 35, when he was only 2 points behind back in February and actually led amongst outer suburban voters and men, and now he's behind in both those groups by a big score. So I think what's happened is there's been a fundamental shift, and it actually has been driven by the rejection of Peter Dutton as an alternative Prime Minister. Voters may not have made up their mind about exactly who they're voting for, but one thing's very clear from our polling, and that is that the voters have decided, at least the majority, is they don't want Peter Dutton as Prime Minister, and that will affect preferences as much as the primary votes in this election. And I think that makes a Labor government of either majority or minority an almost certain outcome at this stage.
Those are some really interesting points you make there, Paul Smith. Thank you very much for your time. We'll wait and see the final poll on Saturday. Thanks for joining Afternoon Briefing.
Thank you.
Now, as we discussed with Sophie Scamps a little earlier, many people grabbing a coffee over Easter or Anzac Day, the long weekends. Perhaps yourself, you might have been hit with a public holiday surcharge, which the hospitality industry says is needed to pay for penalty rates. In an interview with the Financial Review over the weekend, Anthony Albanese criticised this common practice. He says businesses didn't have to pass the cost on to customers. It was a choice. I'm joined now by Wes Lambert from the Australian Restaurant and Cafe Association. Wes, welcome to Afternoon Briefing.
Thank you.
Does the Prime Minister have a point here? Why do cafes and restaurants charge surcharges on public holidays and sometimes Sundays?
Well, look, they don't have a choice. And certainly hospitality businesses have been the hardest hit segment during this cost of living and cost of doing business crisis, with the second highest insolvency rate next to construction. And so we've had demand issues in the hospitality industry since really the beginning of 2023, so over 2 years. And it really isn't a choice for those businesses. Wages are up 15% and soon to be up again, with the Minimum Wage Review Committee coming to their decision by the end of this fiscal year. They have to charge public and weekend surcharges in order to cover the up to 250% increase in wages. And ultimately, consumers will pay that. Now, whether they pay it with a very transparent public and weekend surcharge, or whether they pay it with increased menu prices, the consumer will always have to cover the cost of a business.
Does that extra surcharge that customers pay, does it always go on to staff? I know some hospitality workers kind of have a flat rate, even if it is a public holiday. So how do we know that our money is being passed on to the staff members?
So look, the nature of the hospitality industry, which is highly casualized, many, if not most of the individuals working on public holidays and weekends are on a rate that draws a penalty. And so, yes, the public holiday surcharge certainly goes to staff because baristas, level 3 baristas on a public holiday make up to $70 per hour in a cafe. And so it's huge and tremendous pressure on restaurants and cafes to bear those extra wages. And many businesses want to be transparent with their customers, and they want them to see that they do have to pay up to 250% additional wages on public holidays and some Sundays, rather than just bearing it in increased menu prices on the weekends.
It's already costing people a lot to go to cafes and restaurants, though. The price of coffee just seems to be ever rising. Is it just going to continue that the cost of going out for a meal is just going to keep getting higher?
Look, if the Minimum Wage Review Committee continues to raise wages between 3 and 4% between now and the Olympics, we'll see penalty rates approaching $100 per hour for hospitality workers. And so this is a pressure that the industry just can't bear. Restaurants and cafes make under 5% profit, so no one is gouging. No one is making extra money out of having public holiday and weekend surcharges. Look, they go to cover penalty rates, and penalty is just another word for punishment. And it seems that restaurants and cafes are the ones being punished.
Just to pick you up on that, are you suggesting that hospitality workers shouldn't get paid as much?
No, but I think that there are many other ways to make it more fair. The Fair Work Act, the word fair is the first word. It needs to be fair for everyone. It needs to be fair for the business, for the employees, and for consumers. And ultimately, when it's out of balance and it causes these type of discussions, then it certainly isn't fair.
There's been a lot of talk this election campaign about migration as well. Are you worried that proposed cuts to migration, particularly from the coalition, could impact on the hospitality workforce?
Well, look, we currently have about 45,000 open jobs in hospitality, and we are always needing more employees. And look, the skilled migrants and the international students and working holidaymakers, when those numbers are cut, it certainly affects the industry. But we would look to them, to the coalition and or the current government to continue to fund workforce initiatives like the apprenticeship subsidies that were announced as a policy position, but also to the government, if it stays in power, to look at ways to drive more individuals into the food trades and into the hospitality industries. Free TAFE is not necessarily working for the food trades, and we certainly would like to work with the government to get more people into the trades.
Very, very quickly, Wes, do you expect the price of coffee, how expensive will that be come the Olympics? Just very briefly.
Well, it's a great question. So 50 years ago, a cup of coffee was just 51 cents. And I'm sure that back then, if you'd If you'd have told them it was going to be $6, they'd have said no way. So I think $7 to $8.
Okay, thank you very much, Wes, for your time. That's all we have time for on Afternoon Briefing. Thanks for watching.